France, July 1944. The air hangs heavy, thick with a nauseating, sweet stench, the smell of cattle carcasses rotting under the summer sun. It is mixed with the acrid bite of diesel smoke and the sulfurous stang of high explosives for the soldiers of the American First Army trapped deep in the hinterlands of Normandy. The shining halo of D-Day, that symbol of liberation and victory, has long since faded. In its place, a bone-deep despair has set in. The Allies had secured their foothold on Omaha and Utah beaches. The Nazis' vaunted Atlantic Wall had been breached. Yet, just as the Allied commanders believed the continent was open for the taking, they slammed headlong into a natural defensive line. This line was far more terrifying than any concrete bunker, the Bocage. This was the hedgerow country. It was a green maze woven together by millions of years of geology and centuries of French peasant labor. To understand the sheer horror of what happened next, you must understand the terrain. These were not the polite, manicured garden hedges of a suburban neighborhood. In the Normandy countryside, every single field was encased by these ancient barriers. Their foundations were massive earthen walls, 3 to 6 feet thick, piled up over hundreds of years. They were piled up by farmers clearing stones and marking boundaries. Atop these rock-hard earthen berms grew dense, impenetrable thickets of hawthorn, brambles, and massive, ancient oaks. The roots of these trees had dug deep, twisting like steel tentacles into every crevice of the stone and soil, binding the earth into a substance as tough as reinforced concrete. These hedgerows towered 10 to 15 feet high, blocking out the sun and slicing the battlefield into thousands of enclosed, claustrophobic killing boxes, each only a few hundred yards wide. For a tanker, this was hell on earth. In this maze, visibility was compressed to zero. A tank commander peering through his periscopes saw only endless walls of green. You didn't know what lay behind the wall. You didn't know if the next corner hid a German Tiger tank or an 88mm anti-aircraft gun camouflaged so perfectly it was invisible. The American advantage in armored numbers evaporated here. Tanks were forced to drive in single file in narrow sunken lanes, becoming perfect targets for German ambushes. Crucially, when the Americans tried to force a breakthrough, they found themselves in a tactical death trap. Imagine you are driving a 33-ton M4 Sherman tank. You are facing one of these seemingly ordinary earthen walls. You have no choice. You order the driver to gun the engine, trying to ram over it or climb it. The Sherman's engine roars in agony, its tracks spinning madly, churning up the soil. The massive steel hull begins to climb the slope of the hedgerow. And in that precise moment, disaster strikes. As the nose of the tank pitches upward toward the sky, the entire vehicle exposes its most vulnerable, lethal weakness: the belly armor. It is barely an inch thick, insufficient to stop even heavy machine gun fire, and it is now completely exposed. It is like a boxer in the ring dropping his guard and lifting his chin, begging for a knockout blow. On the other side of the hedge, hidden in foxholes, German anti-tank gunners are waiting. They grin coldly as they squeeze the triggers. Even a 16-year-old Hitler youth recruit, armed with a simple, disposable Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket, can punch through a Sherman's belly at this range with ease. Boom! A dull thud is followed instantly by the shriek of tearing metal. A jet of molten copper superheated by the explosion pierces the floor, igniting the fuel and ammunition stored inside. The Sherman, notorious for its gasoline engines and tendency to explode, earned the grim nickname Ronson from American troops after the lighter's slogan, "Lights first time, every time." Within seconds, the multi-$1,000 war machine becomes a crematorium. The 5 men inside oft and don't even have time to scream before the flames consume them. Those who manage to bail out are oft on living torches, rolling in the mud in agony before they die. In the 6 short weeks following the invasion, the Americans lost over 400 tanks to these accursed hedgerows. This wasn't just a loss of equipment, it was the collapse of morale. Countless veteran soldiers watched their friends burn to death right in front of them. instilling a deep, primal fear of those green walls. The infantry dared not advance without tank cover. The tanks dared not move because the hedges were a death sentence. The entire First Army was pinned down, gaining only a few hundred yards a day, oft losing ground by nightfall. In General Loam, our Bradley's headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocating. The battle lines on the map looked like a coagulated scar and moving. Engineers tried everything. Dozers, the blades were too high, and the unarmed drivers were sniper bait. Dynamite, to blow a gap wide enough for a tank, required hundreds of pounds of C4, drilling holes, setting wires. Long before the job was done, German mortars would turn the engine ears into pink mist. And even if they succeeded, the massive explosion was just a dinner bell telling the Germans, "Hey, we're coming through right here." Stalemate, a deadly, grinding stalemate. Millions of allied troops and thousands of tons were bottled up on a narrow beachhead, in danger of being pushed back into the sea. If this deadlock wasn't broken, the victory, the B- day, would rot on the vine. But the turning points of history are rarely found in gilded conference rooms. They are found in the grease-stained trenches of the front line. Shift your gaze to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 2nd Armored Division. Here, we find a sergeant named Curtis Culin. He is 29 years old. Before the war, he lived in Cranford, New Jersey, a completely ordinary young American. He had no illustrious family background, no genius engineering degree. He was just a tanker, driven to the brink of insanity. It was a stifling hot afternoon in July. Culin and his squad were sitting around their tank, exhausted, debating how not to burn to death in the bushes. Someone suggested using saws to cut the trees. Someone else suggested more explosives. Suddenly, a hillbilly kid from Tennessee, a private named Roberts, mumbled something. He mumbled through a mouthful of rations. If we could just put some big teeth on the tank, like the kind we use to pull stumps back home, maybe we could just dig these walls up. That sentence struck Culin's brain like a bolt of lightning. He stood up abruptly, his eyes fixed on the distant direction. His eyes fixed on the distant direction of Omaha Beach. On that beach lay thousands of German defensive obstacles. The Czech hedgehogs. They were massive anti-landing barriers made of 3 heavy steel I-beams welded together. Originally placed by Field Marshal Rommel to tear the bottoms out of Allied landing craft. Now they were useless scrap. Rusting in the sand. But in Culin's eyes, that wasn't scrap metal. That was the key God had left for him. Culin's mind raced, if we cut that hard German steel. If we cut that steel into sharp plowshares and welded them to the underside of the tank's nose. When the tank hits the hedge, these blades would bite into the base of the wall first. Using the tank's momentum and leverage, we wouldn't climb the wall, we would shovel it up by the roots. It was a crazy idea. Turning a tank into a bulldozer, this violated every manual in the Armored Corps. But Culin didn't care. With the help of a few mechanic buddies, he began an authorized field modification. They dragged back several Czech hedgehogs. Using acetylene torches, they sliced the heavy steel beams into jagged, sharp husks. In a makeshift field repair shop in Columbia Rays, sparks flew. Culin personally oversaw the work, welding these steel plates, looking like the fangs of a saber-toothed tiger, onto the lower front hull of a light tank, at a precise 35-degree angle. This angle was critical. Too steep, and the tank would stop dead. Too shallow, and it would slide up the slope. 35 degrees was the golden angle Culin had calculated. Through endless mental simulations, July 13, 1944, 9:42 a.m. This was a moment destined for the history books of armored warfare. A strange-looking tanks at idling, in front of a specially selected massive hedgerow. This wall was thicker and taller than usual, practically a small mountain. General Bradley, having heard the rumors, stood by his jeep, arms crossed, brow furrowed. He didn't have much hope for this soldier's gadget, but he was desperate enough to try any absurd idea. Sergeant Culin, hands covered in grease, stood nervously to the side. He signaled the tank commander. The engine roared, the tracks kicked up dust. The grotesque tank did not slow down. Like a maddened bull, it charged full speed, 25 miles per hour, straight at the green wall. Everyone watching instinctively flinched, waiting for the sickening crunch of impact and the sight of the tank flipping over. C, or UNCH, or IIIP, the sound was wrong. It wasn't the sharp crack of metal on stone, but a dull, tearing roar. Before their eyes, a miracle occurred. The tank's nose did not lift a single inch. Those crude, rusty steel teeth sliced into the base of the earthen wall like a hot knife through butter. The immense kinetic energy converted into terrifying shearing force. Centuries-old oak roots, thick as a man's thigh, worse ever instantly. Tons of earthen brush were scooped up and rolled aside. Amidst a cloud of dust, the tank roared on, pushing a massive ball of dirt and branches ahead of it, punching straight through the hedgerow. It didn't stop. The tracks rolled over the freshly cleared, flat path, and the tank emerged steadily on the other side. The hull was level. The gun was still pointing forward, ready to fire. The whole process took less than 3 seconds. There was a dead silence, followed immediately by a thunderous cheer. General Bradley was stunned. Forgetting his general's composure, he ran to the gaping hole the tank had torn open. He squatted down, running his hands over the severed roots, his eyes gleaming with ecstatic realization. "This isn't just a breakthrough," the general muttered. "This is the ticket to victory." He spun around, pointed a finger at Culin, and shouted to his aide, "I want this. I want every tank to have this. Drag every piece of scrap metal off the beach. If that's not enough, tear up the railroads, tear down the bridges. I want 3,000 of these tanks before Operation Cobra begins." A race against time began. Operation Cobra, the massive Allied breakout plan, was scheduled for just 12 days later. To modify 3,000 tanks in 12 days? In the factories of Detroit during peacetime, maybe. But on the front lines of Normandy, with supplies scarce and German artillery within range, it sounded like a fantasy. But these American G's did it. The entire logistics department of the First Army went into a frenzy. Hundreds of welders from the 52nd Ordnance Group were urgently assembled. Omaha Beach instantly transformed into a colossal open-air arsenal. Day and night, thousands of blue electric welding arcs flashed along the shoreline, blindingly bright even at midnight. The air smelled of ozone, molten metal, and anxiety. There were no standard blueprints, no assembly lines. Soldiers broke into countless 3-man teams, one to scavenge the ruins for steel, dragging back those damn Czech hedgehogs, one to use the acetylene torches to cut the beams into spiked shapes, and the third to crawl under the tank chassis, braving the heat and falling slag, to weld these heavy beasts onto the hull. Materials ran out fast. The B chopsticles were stripped clean, so they turned their eyes to the bombed-out railways. Engineers swarmed like hungry ants, ripping up tracks. Every section of rail was sharpened to a razor point and turned into a tank's tusk. This wasn't just technical work, it was brute labor. Each device weighed over 300 pounds, hoisted into place by shoulders and makeshift pulleys. No one complained. No one rested. Every welder knew that for every minute their torch burned, fewer brothers on the front line would die. Sergeant Culin spun like a top, moving between field repair shops, personally teaching new welders how to hit that critical 35-degree angle. Late night, July 24th, the eve of the general offensive, if you stood on a high ridge overlooking the American assembly area, you would have seen a chilling sight. Under the moonlight, thousands of Sherman tanks lay in wait. Their noses were no longer smooth curves. They bristled with jagged, gleaming steel fangs. These were no longer passive turtles. They were a pack of prehistoric beasts, armored and armed, grinding their teeth, waiting for the kill. July 25th, dawn. Codename Cobra. The gates of hell opened. 1,500 Allied heavy bombers darkened the sky like storm clouds, dumping 4,000 tons of high explosives. Dumping high explosives onto the German lines. The earth trembled, as if the world were ending. But this was only the prelude. As the smoke cleared and the concussed German soldiers shook off the dust, they grabbed their weapons and rushed to their defensive positions along the hedges. They thought this would be another routine American attack. Infantry pinned down in the open, tanks exposing their bellies as they tried to climb, easy targets for the slaughter. But this time, the vibration coming from the ground felt different. Through the morning mist, German anti-tank gunners saw a sight that froze their blood. The American tanks, those Shermans that usually waddled like ducks, were charging at them at incredible speed. They weren't slowing down. They weren't looking for gaps. They were driving straight into the ancient hedgerows that even heavy artillery struggled to destroy. Are they crazy? They'll crash. A German officer screamed in his mind, and then his reality shattered. The tanks punched through the hedges as if they were made of cardboard. Soil exploded into the air, trees toppled. The carefully camouflaged German anti-tank positions, built using the hedges as cover, were instantly stripped of their protection. Before the German gunners could even traverse their barrels, the terrifying steel tusks were already looming over them. C-R-A-S-H. On one sector, a Sherman equipped with the Rhino cutter plowed straight through a machine gun nest. The 3 German soldiers inside didn't even have time to scream before they were churned into the mud beneath the tracks. The American tactical playbook had been rewritten. They no longer followed the roads. They carved their own superhighways through the fields. In the sector of the 741st Tank Battalion, C Company smashed through 3 defensive lines in just 20 minutes. Such speed was a myth in the previous 6 weeks of fighting. Panic flooded the German radio channels. The line is broken. Tanks are everywhere. They are coming out of the walls. Mein Gott, what are these monsters? Inside a Sherman tank, a commander named Johnson watched the battle through his periscope. Since morning, they had rammed through 14 hedgerows. Every impact felt like a car crash, the violent shaking rattling his teeth, but he had never felt so alive. Target left front, AP round. Fire, Johnson roared. There was no awkward climbing, no exposed belly. The Shermans had flattened stable in the gap it had just cut, and its 75mm gun barked, sending an armor-piercing shell straight into a panzer for that was trying to flee. The German tank erupted in flames. Good shot, next one. The green hell had become the Americans' playground thanks to Culin's invention. The natural barriers the Germans relied on had become cages preventing their retreat. Their flanks were exposed, supply lines cut, and the entire defensive line collapsed like dominoes. Of course, no invention is perfect. In the chaos of combat, tragedy still struck. About 4% of the modified devices failed in action. Some welds done in haste snapped after repeated impacts. Others sheared off when they hit massive granite boulders hidden deep within the earthen walls. The most gruesome incident occurred at 11I. A tank from the 3rd Armored Division charged a patch of brush. That looked thin, unaware that it concealed a reinforced concrete anti-tank pylon. The immense force of the impacts napped the steel tusks instantly. The severed steel beams flew back like shrapnel, smashing through the driver's vision port. The driver was killed instantly, and the out-of-control tank careened into a ditch, becoming a sitting duck for German fire. Other tanks suffered broken suspensions. The extra weight of the tusks on the nose proving too much for the springs, leaving them stranded in the middle of the battlefield. But even that 4% failure rate could not overshadow the brilliance of the other 96%. Numbers do not lie. Post-battle statistical reports showed that in the first 2 weeks of Operation Cobra, from July 25th to August 10th, the tank casualty rate of the First Army dropped by a staggering 37%. This isn't just a cold percentage. It means that roughly 300 Sherman tanks, which were statistically destined to be burning wrecks, survived. More importantly, it means that approximately 1,500 young American tankers did not burn to ash in front of those accursed hedges. That is 1,500 living, breathing human beings, 1,500 sons, 1,500 husbands, 1,500 fathers. August 15th, the smoke had barely settled. In a French wheat field freshly liberated from Nazi control, a special ceremony took place. There was no red carpet, no marching band. General Bradley stood on the hood of his Jeep. Before him stood Sergeant Curtis Culin, his uniform still stained with grease and the grime of war. The general took a medal from his aide, the Legion of Merit. This was an honor usually reserved for high-ranking officers for strategic contributions, almost never awarded to a common sergeant. General Bradley's voice was thick with emotion as he looked at the awkward young man. "Sergeant," he said, "you did what a general staff of hundreds of officers and experts could not do. You took a pile of scrap metal from a beach and gave wings to our army. From here to Paris, every tanker alive owes you his life." Culin simply saluted. He didn't say much. To him, he had just done a job that needed doing. But stories don't always end with flowers and applause. After the war, Culin turned down offers for promotion. He left the Army in 1945 and returned to New Jersey, slipping back into the life of an ordinary office worker. He locked the medal in the back of a drawer. He rarely spoke of those days. Even his neighbors had no idea that this balding, middle-aged man with a briefcase had once, with a few strips of scrap iron, altered the course of World War II. In 1963, on the eve of the 20th anniversary of D-Day, Curtis Culin died of illness. He was only 48. He passed away quietly, just like so many unsung heroes of that war. It wasn't until 1960 for that former President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander during the war, told the story of the Rhino tank to the nation in a televised memorial program. Eisenhower pointed to a yellowed wartime photograph of a Sherman with its steel tusks. "This is the essence of the American spirit. We may not always have the perfect weapon, but we have the smartest, bravest soldiers." A sergeant from New Jersey used his wits to turn a dead end into a highway. Today, in the General Patton Museum of Leadership at Fort Knox, Kentucky, a low NEM for Sherman tank still sits, retaining its original field modification. It is a witness to history. When you get close to it, if you reach out and touch those rusty, rough welds, you can almost feel the heat of that summer in 1944 on Omaha Beach. You can hear the deafening crackle of the welding torches and the roar of the engines. As they tore down the walls of the tyrants, Sergeant Culin is gone. But he left behind more than an invention. He taught us that beneath the grand narrative of war, every single individual has the power to be the fulcrum that moves history. Even if you have nothing but a pile of scrap metal in your hands, with enough courage and wit, you can forge the fangs that pierce the darkness. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unsung heroes of armored warfare, smash that like button and subscribe for more tactical breakdowns. I'm your strategy observer. We'll see you on the next battlefield.